The first thing you must understand about Napa Valley is that the silence here is different. It's not an absence of sound, it's a presence. It's the weight of the morning fog settling between the vines, the slow, patient breathing of the earth, the decades of sunlight stored deep within the skin of a Cabernet grape. I grew up in this silence. It was my first language, the language of the Caldwell family. We were masters of the unspoken, our sprawling vineyard a testament to everything we felt, but never dared to say. My name is Elena Caldwell, and for the first 22 years of my life, my own voice was just another one of the valley's silent things. Our estate, Caldwell Crest, was a postcard of Napa success. A grand Victorian house, painted a crisp, respectable white, perched on a hill overlooking hundreds of acres of some of the most valuable grape-growing land in the world. To the outside world, the Caldwell name was synonymous with tradition, with excellence, with the kind of old-world legacy that money alone can't buy. Our bottles graced the tables of senators and the cellars of billionaires. My father, Richard Caldwell, was not just a winemaker. He was a patriarch in the truest sense of the word, a man whose presence could change the atmospheric pressure in a room. He didn't run a business. He presided over a dynasty. And in every dynasty, there is an heir. My older brother Ethan was born for the role. He had our father's height, his easy smile, and a natural charm that could coax a story from a stone. He wore the Caldwell name like a bespoke suit, comfortable and entitled. He majored in marketing at Stanford and could speak for hours about branding, about market positioning, about the lifestyle we were selling. He just couldn't tell you the difference between clay loam and sandy soil, or why a sudden drop in temperature before harvest could make or break a vintage. Those were my secrets. I was the quiet one, the shadow that followed the legacy. While Ethan was learning to network, I was learning the land. I inherited my grandfather's obsession, not with the name, but with the soil itself. I spent my summers not at debutante balls in San Francisco, but walking the rows with our vineyard manager, my fingers stained with dirt and grape juice. I could read the vines like a book. A curled leaf told me of a nitrogen deficiency. The feel of the soil told me how deep my spreadsheets and soil analysis were a sterile academic insult to the art form he practiced. You can't capture terroir in a test tube, Eleanor, he would say, his voice thick with dismissive disappointment. You feel it. It's in your blood or it isn't. What he meant was, it was in Ethan's blood. The silence was loudest at our family dinners. They were formal affairs in a dining room paneled with dark, intimidating wood. Ethan would recount his successes, his new connections, his brilliant ideas for a new label design. My mother, Catherine, a woman whose elegance was both her shield and her cage, would listen with a radiant, practiced smile. Her job was to keep the peace, which in our family meant ensuring the quiet hum of the status quo was never disturbed. Whenever I tried to bring up my research, a new irrigation technique I'd read about, or a blight resistant rootstock I was studying, the conversation would be gently but firmly steered away. My father's eyes would glaze over. My mother would ask Ethan about his golf game. I would feel myself shrinking, my voice dissolving back into the silence. But I had a secret. For 2 years, I had been working on a project, a culmination of everything I had learned and everything I believed our vineyard could be. It was a comprehensive plan for sustainable viticulture. Using advanced sensor technology to monitor soil moisture, drone imagery to detect vine stress, and a proprietary organic pesticide I had been developing. It was revolutionary. It could cut our water usage by 40%, increase our yield, and protect our vines from the droughts that were beginning to plague the valley. It wasn't just an idea, it was our future. I had poured my entire soul into a 100-page proposal, complete with financial projections, market analysis, and scientific data. I was ready to finally break the silence. I requested a formal meeting with my father and Ethan. For the first time, I wasn't going to suggest an idea. I was going to present a finished, undeniable vision. As I stood before them in my father's imposing study, the leather bound proposal feeling like a shield in my hands, I truly believed this was the moment. I detailed the symbiotic relationship between the cover crops I'd chosen and the nitrogen levels in the soil. I presented the financial models showing a projected 15% increase in profits within 3 years, not from selling more wine, but from making our process smarter, stronger, and more sustainable. I watched their faces as I spoke. Ethan was unnervingly still, his usual easygoing posture replaced by a focused intensity. He wasn't looking at me, but at the proposal on the table, his fingers tracing the embossed Caldwell crest on the cover. My father listened, his expression unreadable, his hand stroking his chin. When I finished, the silence that fell was different. It wasn't dismissive, it was heavy, charged with thought. For a wild, hopeful moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pride in my father's eyes, a glint of respect I had spent my entire life trying to earn. This is comprehensive, Eleanor, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He picked up the proposal, feeling its weight. Ambitious. But these technologies, drones, sensors, it feels more like Silicon Valley than Napa Valley. Our customers buy a story, they buy tradition, they buy the feeling that this wine was made by a man's hands, not a machine's algorithm. It's not about replacing the art, I countered, my voice steady. It's about protecting it. This science gives the artist a better canvas to work with. Ethan finally spoke, his voice smooth as aged port. The ROI projections are impressive. If we could spin this right, market it as the future of tradition, it could be a powerful narrative. He was looking at my father, not me. My father nodded slowly. I'll need to think on this. It's a significant capital investment, a significant risk. He closed the proposal and placed it squarely in the center of his desk, a final, definitive barrier between us. Leave it with me. We'll discuss it further in due time. That evening, I found my mother in the garden, tending to her prize winning roses. The setting sun cast a golden light on her, making her look like a figure from a painting. I told her about the meeting, about the flicker of hope, the wall of caution. She listened, snipping a dead leaf from a stem with delicate precision. Patience, my love, she said, not looking at me. Your father built this place from the ground up. He doesn't leap. He takes careful, measured steps. You presented your case beautifully, I'm sure. Now, you must let him see the wisdom in it on his own terms. She turned to me then, her smile bright and meaningless. What matters is that the family moves forward together. Her words were meant to be comforting, but all in good time. Then an email arrived. Another family meeting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked back into the study. This was it. My father sat behind his desk, but it was Ethan who stood before the fireplace, radiating a confident energy that filled the room. Dad, Elena, he began with a broad smile. For the past month, I've been working on a new strategic vision for Caldwell Crest, a way to honor our past while rocketing us into the future. I call it the Phoenix Initiative. My blood ran cold. He started to speak, and the words that came out of his mouth were my words, my concepts, my vision, all twisted and repackaged in his slick commercial language. He talked about synergistic growth and eco luxury branding. He presented slides with sleek graphics showing drones flying over vineyards, graphics I recognized from the tech journals I had left on my desk. He had stolen it, all of it. He had taken my soul's work, stripped it of its science and its heart, and was wearing it like a costume. I was paralyzed, a scream trapped in my throat. I looked to my father. He was glowing, his face alight with a paternal pride I had never seen directed at me. He saw his son, the marketer, finally becoming a visionary. He saw his legacy secured. Then my eyes shot to my mother, who was sitting in a wingback chair by the window. She was looking down at her hands, her fingers knotted together in her lap. She refused to meet my gaze, and in that instant the floor fell away. She knew. She had known all along. This wasn't just a theft, it was a sacrifice. I was the lamb being led to slaughter to ensure the golden heir could ascend the throne. My father's pride, my brother's ambition, my mother's peace, it all required my silence. And in that room, surrounded by the three people who were supposed to be my world, I had never been more voiceless or more profoundly alone. People think betrayal is a single sharp act, like the plunge of a knife. But the truth is, the deepest betrayals are not acts at all, they are pacts. They are the silent, unspoken agreements made in the quiet corners of a family, the collective decision to look away from a painful truth. My project wasn't stolen in a single moment of villainy. It was sacrificed, piece by piece, on the altar of my family's deepest flaws. To understand how I ended up voiceless in that study, you have to understand the people who took my voice away. My father, Richard Caldwell, was a man forged by will. He hadn't inherited Caldwell Crest, he had created it. He'd started with a small, struggling parcel of land and a second mortgage, and through sheer, in the way one loves, a beautiful, intricate clock. He was proud of my intelligence, but he didn't know what to do with it. It didn't fit into the simple, powerful narrative he had constructed for his life. I remember when I was 12, I won the state science fair for a project on yeast genetics. I came home beaming, my blue ribbon in hand. That same afternoon, Ethan, who was 16, managed to fix an old tractor engine with the help of our vineyard manager. That night at dinner, my father raised a glass of his finest reserve. To Ethan, he'd boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous dining room. A true Caldwell, a man who knows how to work with his hands. My science ribbon sat on the sideboard, unmentioned. My father didn't see me as a successor. He saw me as a fascinating but ultimately irrelevant sidebar to the main story. Ethan, my brother, was the story's leading man. He was blessed with the kind of effortless charisma that made people want to agree with him. But beneath the charm was a chasm of insecurity. He knew on some level that he was playing a role. He had the title, the name, the expectation, but he didn't have the gift. The deep intuitive connection to the land that our grandfather had and that I had inherited had skipped him entirely. He saw the vineyard not as a living thing, but as a stage for his own ambition. His theft of my work wasn't just an act of greed, it was an act of survival. I see that now. He was drowning in the weight of our father's expectations, and my proposal was a life raft. He didn't see the years of research, the passion, the soul I had poured into it. He saw a collection of brilliant marketable concepts that he could use to finally, truly become the heir our father wanted. I believe he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. In his mind, I was just a scientist with abstract ideas. He was the visionary who could turn them into reality, who could give them a name and a platform. He probably thought I should be grateful. The cruelty of it wasn't in the theft itself, but in his complete self-serving inability to see that he was stealing a part of my soul. And then there was my mother, Catherine. Her betrayal was the most complicated and the most painful. My mother was the curator of our family's image. Her life's work was to ensure that the facade of the perfect, powerful Caldwell clan never cracked. She operated under one guiding principle, the preservation of peace. But her peace was a fragile, brittle thing that required constant sacrifice, and I was the designated offering. She saw the storm brewing between my father's traditionalism, Ethan's ambition, and my quiet, disruptive brilliance. She knew a choice had to be made, and she made it. She chose the path of least resistance. She chose the son who fit the narrative over the daughter who would rewrite it. I remember her coming to my room the night after the theft. I was sitting in the dark. She just stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the hall light. Sometimes, Elena, she'd whispered, her voice trembling slightly. For a family to survive, one person has to bend. It's not fair, it's just the way it is. Your brother, he needs this. The family needs him to succeed. She wasn't apologizing, she was explaining the terms of my surrender. She was asking me to bleed quietly so as not to stain the family portrait. In that moment, I realized I wasn't the daughter of a family. I was the structural weakness in an edifice, a crack that had to be plastered over. They weren't just three individuals who had wronged me. They were a system, a self protecting organism that had identified me as a threat and had, with silent, unified precision, neutralized me. A lie is like a rot. You can't see it at first, but from the inside out, it poisons everything it touches. Ethan's Phoenix initiative was a beautiful shining lie, and it began to poison Caldwell Crest the moment my father gave it his blessing. Ethan had my words, but he had none of my understanding. He approached my plan not as a delicate ecosystem to be nurtured, but as a shopping list for success. He bought the most expensive drones, the fanciest soil sensors, the shiniest new fermentation tanks. He hired a team of slick marketing consultants from San Francisco who talked about synergy and disruption, but wouldn't know a grapevine from a weed. I watched it all unfold like a slow motion nightmare. I was a ghost in my own vineyard, my presence a constant, silent accusation that no one wanted to acknowledge. I saw the new irrigation system, based on my designs, being calibrated all wrong. They were flooding the mallow block, drowning the roots, while the Chardonnay vines on the ridge were starting to show signs of thirst, their leaves curling in the afternoon sun. I tried to warn Ethan to show him the data on my tablet, but he just laughed it off. Elena, please, he said, patting my shoulder with infuriating condescension. Let the big boys handle this. We have experts. His experts were seeing numbers on a screen. I was hearing the dying whispers of the land I loved. The rot festered for a full season. The grand marketing campaign launched, promising a revolutionary vintage, a wine that blended centuries of tradition with the precision of the 21st century. The wine magazines wrote glowing articles. The anticipation was palpable, and all the while I knew the grapes being harvested were suffering. The sugar levels were inconsistent, the acidity was off. The soul of the wine was being systematic. He held his glass to the light, a proud smile on his face, ready to toast his son's triumph. He swirled the wine, inhaled its aroma, and took a sip. I will never forget the look on his face. The pride dissolved into confusion, then into a dawning, horrified disbelief. The wine was wrong. It was thin, unbalanced, with a bitter, chemical aftertaste. It was the ghost of what a Caldwell wine should be. It was a failure, a very public, very expensive $50 million failure. The fallout was swift and brutal. Orders were cancelled, our reputation was shattered, but the worst was yet to come. A week after the disastrous tasting, I heard shouting from my father's study. I crept down the hall and heard my father's voice, not booming with authority, but cracked with a pain I had never heard before. You didn't listen, he was saying to Ethan. She tried to tell you the details. You never listened to the details. Then there was a heavy, sickening thud. My father had suffered a massive stroke. He survived, but the man who emerged was a fragile shadow of his former self, his powerful voice reduced to a slurred whisper, his right side paralyzed. The invincible patriarch had fallen, and in the terrifying vacuum of his absence, my family needed a villain. Ethan, desperate and terrified, found one. He found me. In the hushed, frantic conversations with bankers and distributors, a new story began to take shape. It was Eleanor's radical academic ideas that had failed. She had been the one pushing for this untested technology. Ethan had merely been trying to appease his ambitious little sister. Her recklessness had nearly bankrupted the company, and worse, it had broken her father's heart and his health. My mother, lost in a fog of grief and fear, did not defend me. To defend me would be to admit her own complicity, to admit the entire family structure was a lie. And so she remained silent, her silence a final, damning verdict. I was no longer a daughter, I was a curse. No one had to say the words. I felt it in their averted. The air didn't smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine. It smelled of hot asphalt and diesel fumes. The silence wasn't filled with the rustling of vines. It was shattered by the shriek of sirens. It was the perfect place to disappear. The first thing I did was kill Eleanor Caldwell. I walked into a cheap salon and had the hairdresser chop off my long, dark hair. The hair my mother always said was my best feature. I watched it fall to the linoleum floor, each strand a tie to a life that was no longer mine. I donated my expensive, tasteful clothes and bought jeans and worn t-shirts from a thrift store. And then I gave myself a new name. Cora Vance. Cora, for the core of who I was, the part of me they couldn't break. Vance, an old word for a marshland, a place of fertile, untamed earth. Eleanor Caldwell was the dutiful daughter, the heartbroken victim. Cora Vance would be an architect. She would build on solid ground. Those first years were a blur of sheer survival. I worked as a waitress, a coder for a soulless tech startup, a data entry clerk. I lived in a tiny, sterile apartment where the only view was a brick wall. Every spare dollar, every spare moment was poured into my work. The anger and the grief didn't fade. Instead, I learned to use them. They were no longer just a source of pain, they became a source of power. I channeled the searing heat of my betrayal into a cold, clean fire of ambition. The memory of my father's broken face, of my mother's averted eyes, became the engine that drove me through 18-hour workdays. My family's failure had taught me a brutal but valuable lesson. My original plan for Caldwell Crest had been brilliant, but it had one fatal flaw. It required an intelligent, intuitive user. It could be corrupted by incompetence. My brother had proven that. So, I set out to build something that even a fool couldn't break. I began designing a new system, an agricultural intelligence platform. It wouldn't just give farmers data, it would give them answers. It would integrate drone imagery, soil sensors, and weather patterns into a proprietary AI that didn't just report problems, it predicted them. It would tell a farmer in simple, direct language, water grid C7 for 22 minutes. You have an early stage fungal infection on the north slope. Treat with this organic compound tomorrow at dawn. A heat wave is coming in 3 days. Your vines will need these nutrients to survive it. I was creating a foolproof system for listening to the land. I called my company Terraform Dynamics. I started with nothing. I used my venture capital came calling, but I was cautious. I had learned the hard way about losing control. I took funding from a small, forward-thinking firm that believed in my vision and, crucially, in me. I kept a majority stake. I hired a team of brilliant, hungry outsiders like me, engineers, data scientists, agronomists who didn't fit the corporate mold. Cora Vance became a name whispered with a certain reverence in the agri-tech world. A reclusive, almost mythical founder who never appeared at conferences, who never gave interviews, but whose results were undeniable. 10 years after I stepped off that bus, I stood in my office, on the top floor of the Terraform Dynamics building. I was no longer looking at a brick wall. I was looking out over a city I had, in a way, conquered. On a vast screen that covered one wall, a satellite map of North America glowed, displaying the health of our clients' farms in pulsing shades of green. My COO walked in, holding a tablet. Cora, he said, the system just flagged a major new business opportunity. A legacy client in the premium agriculture sector is in a death spiral. Their production is down 60% over the last 8 years. They're desperate for a tech overhaul. It's a perfect candidate for our top tier partnership package. He swiped, and a dossier appeared on the main screen. The name was written in elegant, familiar cursive. Caldwell Crest Vineyards, Napa Valley, California. The rot I had fled a decade ago had finally eaten its way to the surface, and my system, my creation, was presenting my family's slow, painful failure to me as a data point, as an acquisition target. They say you can't go home again, but that's not quite right. Sometimes home is a ghost that haunts you, and other times it's a predator that comes looking for you, whether you want it to or not. For a full day after Caldwell Crest appeared on my screen, I did nothing. I watched the data stream in, a constant clinical report of its decline, plummeting profits, worsening soil health, a catastrophic credit rating. Part of me, a dark, wounded part, wanted to simply watch it burn to the ground. But the CEO in me, the part I had spent a decade building, saw something else. My COO, a brilliant man named David, who knew me only as Cora Vance, laid it out perfectly. This isn't just another client, he said, pointing to the screen. I saw the familiar patchwork of vineyards, the winding Silverado Trail, the distant peak of Mount St. Helena. The landscape was a map of my own heart, and I had to remind myself again and again that I was here not as Elena, but as Cora. Caravans required careful construction. 10 years had changed me, but family has a long memory. I had my executive stylist craft a new look. My dark hair was now a sharp platinum blonde bob that was severe and professional. I wore thick-framed non-prescription glasses that subtly altered the lines of my face. My wardrobe was an armor of bespoke power suits in shades of charcoal and navy, a universe away from the soft sweaters and jeans Elena had worn. But the biggest change was internal. I had spent years cultivating a different posture, a different cadence of speech. Elena had been quiet, her voice soft. Cora's voice was a finely tuned instrument of command, calm, low, and deliberate. Elena Caldwell had been erased. I was now my own invention. We played the game perfectly. My team made the initial overtures. We let Caldwell Crest come to us, desperate and supplicating. We made them prove they were worth our time. I reviewed their financials, their production reports, all the data that told the story of Ethan's decade of mismanagement. He had run the vineyard on ego and image, mortgaging their future to maintain the illusion of success. Finally, the day came when the final proposal had to be presented. It was a meeting that required the personal attendance of the reclusive CEO of Terraform Dynamics. Driving through the familiar wrought iron gates of Caldwell Crest felt like passing through the membrane between two worlds. The grounds were still beautiful, but I could see the subtle signs of decay Elena would have noticed instantly. The dry patches in the lawn, the slight neglect in the pruning of the rose bushes, the faded paint on the guest house. The grandeur was still there, but it was tired. I was escorted not to the study, but to the formal boardroom, a place I had only ever seen from the outside. Ethan was there, standing by the head of the table. The 10 years had not been kind. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by the wary anxiety of a man who knew he was failing. My mother sat to his right, her elegance now a brittle shield that barely concealed the fear in her eyes. She looked older, smaller. They both stood as I entered, the deference they showed me automatic and absolute. They were not greeting a long lost daughter, they were greeting a financial titan who held their entire world in her hands. I saw not in, and the voice that filled the room was crisp, cool, and utterly unfamiliar to them. I am Cora Vance. I understand you have a problem. My company is here to solve it. In their eyes, I saw nothing but desperate hope. They were looking at a stranger, praying she would be their salvation, never dreaming she was the ghost they had created. When you are drowning, you don't ask for the name of the person throwing you the rope. You just grab on with both hands and thank God you're saved. My family was drowning in a sea of debt and failure, and I, Cora Vance, was their anonymous rescuer. They didn't question my terms. They couldn't afford to. The deal I put on the table was brutal, surgical, and from a business perspective, undeniably fair. Terraform Dynamics would inject $30 million into Caldwell Crest, saving it from foreclosure. In exchange, we would take a 60% controlling interest in the company. A new board would be appointed by me. A new vineyard manager would be hired by me, and Ethan, the failed prodigal son, would be stripped of his title as president. He would be given the hollow ceremonial role of brand ambassador, a smiling figurehead for a kingdom he no longer ruled. I watched their faces as my lawyer detailed the terms. I saw the flash of fury in Ethan's eyes, quickly extinguished by the cold wave of desperation. I saw the deep, soul crushing humiliation on my mother's face as she realized their sovereignty was over. They fought, for a moment, on minor points, trying to retain some shred of their old power, but they had no leverage. In the end, they signed. They handed their legacy over to a stranger to save it from themselves. Over the next 6 months, I began the meticulous process of healing the land they had poisoned. I implemented the Terraform system, the one I had perfected over a decade. This time, it wasn't just a proposal, it was a deployment. Our technology, managed by my expert team, began to work its quiet magic. We tailored irrigation to the inch, nurtured the soil back to health, and guided the vines with a precision that was both scientific and deeply intuitive. The vineyard, which had been gasping for air, began to breathe again. The results were immediate and staggering. By the time the next harvest came, the grapes were the best they had been in 15 years. Caldwell Crest was saved. In the Napa Valley, Cora Vance was hailed as a miracle worker. The real prize, however, was not the vineyard, it was their pride. I learned that the annual Vintners Guild Gala was approaching, the most prestigious event on the Napa social calendar. And this year, they had created a new category, the Legacy Reborn Award. As the face of the brand, was scheduled to accept the award. It was on that stage, in front of everyone who mattered in their world, that I would orchestrate my final act. As the majority shareholder, my attendance was expected. I informed Ethan I would be joining them at the Cawdor Crest table. He couldn't refuse. In the weeks before the gala, I prepared my case. This wasn't going to be an emotional outburst. It was going to be an execution. I compiled everything, my original 100-page proposal from 10 years prior, time-stamped and saved on an old hard drive, scans of my handwritten notes, Ethan's internal emails from the launch of his Phoenix initiative, where he had plagiarized my work word for word. I created a presentation, a simple, elegant, and damning timeline that laid the truth bare. The night of the gala, the ballroom buzzed with the self-congratulatory hum of old money and new success. I sat at the table, a foreign object in the center of my own family. Ethan was fidgeting with his bow tie, rehearsing his acceptance speech under his breath. My mother was a statue of social grace, her smile stretched tight over her terror. And at the head of the table, in a wheelchair, was my father. It was the first time I had laid eyes on him in a decade. He looked so much smaller, his presence a flickering candle flame where it had once been a bonfire. He gave me, Cora Vance, a weak but grateful smile, the savior of his legacy. The irony was a physical ache in my chest. Then, the moment came. The presenter, a famous wine critic, stepped up to the microphone. "Our next award is a very special one," he announced, his voice booming through the ballroom. "The Legacy Reborn Award. It goes to a vineyard that embodies the spirit of Napa Valley resilience. A story of near tragedy turned into stunning triumph. Ladies and gentlemen, Caldwell Crest." A spotlight hit our table. The room erupted in applause. My mother's eyes filled with tears of relief. My father's hand trembled as he clapped. And Ethan, my brother, pushed back his chair and stood up, his face breaking into a triumphant, relieved smile. He thought this was his redemption. He thought the story was over. I watched him take his first step toward the stage, knowing that he wasn't walking toward a trophy. He was walking toward a truth that would burn his world to the ground. A lifetime of injustice can be compressed into the 10 seconds it takes a man to walk toward a stage to accept an award he didn't earn. The applause in the ballroom was a roaring wave, lifting Ethan up, carrying him toward his moment of fraudulent glory. He was beaming, soaking in the admiration, the public forgiveness for his past failures. At our table, it was a simple movement, quiet and deliberate. Yet it cut through the noise of the room like a shard of glass. A few people nearby noticed, their applause faltering. The spotlight operator, catching the motion, instinctively swung a secondary light onto me, illuminating me at the table. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. The wave of applause crested and then broke, receding into a murmur of confused whispers. At my table, my mother's smile froze, her eyes widening in alarm. Who was this woman? This powerful CEO, disrupting their perfect moment. I started walking toward the stage. Each step was an echo of a step I had taken a decade ago, walking out of my home in disgrace. But this was not an exile. This was an invasion. I held a small black remote in my hand, my thumb resting on the main button. I reached the stage and ascended the steps. Coming to a stop directly beside my brother. He stared at me, his smile a rictus of confusion and dawning panic. The wine critic who had presented the award looked back and forth between us, utterly lost. The ballroom was now profoundly, shockingly silent. I gently took the microphone from the stand. My heart was a cold, steady drum against my ribs. I turned first to my brother, who was now pale and sweating under the hot lights. Before you accept this award, Ethan, I said, my voice the calm, measured tone of Cora Vance, I believe you've forgotten to thank the person most responsible for this legacy reborn. He just stared at me, speechless. I turned to face the audience, the sea of expectant faces, the titans of the industry, our friends and our rivals. I took a breath. A story is being told here tonight, I began, my voice changing, softening slightly, losing its hard corporate edge. But it is not the whole story. The real story began 10 years ago, when a young woman, a daughter of this valley, poured her heart and her mind into a plan to save her family's vineyard, a plan to lead it into the future. As I spoke, I pressed the button on the remote. Behind me, the massive screen. That young woman was blamed, she was cast out, made the scapegoat for her brother's failure and her father's broken health. My voice was shaking now, not with weakness, but with the force of a decade of suppressed truth. Click! The final slide appeared. It was a simple, devastating timeline. The date of my proposal, the date of Ethan's, the financial records showing the company's nosedive under his leadership, and the sharp, undeniable V-shaped recovery in the 6 months since Terraform Dynamics had taken control. I finally lowered the microphone and turned to face my family's table. I looked past my brother's ashen face, past my mother's look of pure horror. I looked directly at my father, who was staring at the screen, his mind struggling to connect the pieces. My name is not Cora Vance, I said, my voice ringing with the clarity of a bell in the silent room. I reached up and slowly, deliberately, took off my glasses, the last piece of my disguise. My name is Eleanor Caldwell, your daughter, and I have come back to claim what is mine. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so deep and so total, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I saw it on their faces, the dawning, catastrophic, soul-shattering recognition. The truth was no longer a secret buried in the past. It was a supernova, and its light was burning them all. The most deafening sound in the world is the silence that follows a truth that can never be unheard. For a full 30 seconds, the ballroom of the Napa Valley Vintners Guild Gala was the quietest place on earth. 300 people held a collective breath, their minds trying to process the impossible. The air itself seemed to crystallize, fragile and tense. And in the center of it all stood the ghost of Eleanor Caldwell, wearing the skin of Cora Vance. On stage beside me, Ethan imploded. The color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, vacant mask. He stumbled back a step, his hand reaching out for the lectern to steady himself, as if the ground had given way beneath him. He opened his mouth, a faint gurgling sound escaping, the ghost of a denial he knew he could never make. The evidence, my face, my voice, the damning slides on the screen behind him. It was absolute. His eyes darted from me to the audience, seeing not admiration but a thousand pairs of judgmental eyes. He looked like a cornered animal. And then he did what he had always done when faced with a truth he couldn't handle. He ran. He turned, not even looking at our family's table, and practically fell down the stage steps, pushing through a curtain and disappearing out a side exit into the night. My gaze shifted to the table. To them, my mother Catherine had both hands. This was a public immolation. I saw her look at the empty space where Ethan had been, then at my father, then back at me. It was a look of such profound, soul deep regret that it almost broke through my icy composure. It was the look of a woman who had just realized that in her desperate attempt to keep her family from falling apart, she had been the one who had personally set it on fire. And my father, Richard Caldwell, the patriarch, the titan, was utterly helpless. Trapped in his wheelchair, he couldn't stand, couldn't flee, couldn't command the room back into order. He could only sit and bear witness to the demolition of his life's work. His eyes, the same eyes that had dismissed me with such casual cruelty, were now wide with the devastating clarity of a man seeing the full truth for the first time. He saw his chosen son for the coward and thief he was. He saw the daughter he had cast aside, returned as a figure of unimaginable power and righteous anger. He wasn't looking at me with hatred. It was something far worse. It was awe, and it was agony. His one good hand gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles turning white, the only outward sign of the tectonic ruin shifting within him. The silence finally broke, not with a bang, but with 1,000 whispers. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Phones were already out, thumbs flying across screens. The scandal was being born in real time. The story of Caldwell Crest's triumphant rebirth was dead. A new, much darker, much more fascinating story was taking its place. I saw the faces in the crowd, our neighbors, our rivals, people who had known me since I was a child, looking at our table with a morbid, electrifying mixture of pity and contempt. In 5 minutes, I had undone 50 years of my family's social standing. My work here was done. I did not smile. I did not shed a tear. I carefully placed the microphone back in its stand. I gave one last, long look at my mother and father, a look that held a decade of pain, anger, and a sorrow so deep I had no name for it. Then I turned and walked off the stage. I didn't use the side exit. I walked down the main steps and proceeded down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me as if I were a queen or an executioner. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. As I reached the grand doors, my COO, David, was waiting, his face pale with shock, but his eyes filled with a new, profound understanding. He simply opened the door for me. I stepped out of the suffocating heat of the ballroom and into the cool, clean air of the Napa night. The chaos I had unleashed was behind me, a muffled roar of a life I had just detonated. The silence I had been forced to live in for so long had finally been broken, but the sound it made was that of shattering crystal. And standing there under the indifferent stars, I had no idea if anything, anyone, could ever be put back together again. Part 10. For 10 years, it was the fire that kept me warm, that gave me light in the darkness, and that guided my every step. It's a powerful, all-consuming force, but when it finally burns out, when the target has been turned to ash, you are left standing alone in the cold, surrounded by the ruins of what you've destroyed. In the days that followed the gala, the world saw me as a victor, a corporate titan who had won the ultimate battle. But I had never felt more empty. The fire was gone, and I didn't know who I was without it. The news cycle was brutal. The Caldwell name was dragged through the mud. Ethan was gone, vanished. My parents had retreated behind the gates of the estate, becoming prisoners in their own home. I stayed in a sterile suite at a Napa hotel, watching the fallout from a distance, feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of the destruction I had created. The driving purpose that had fueled me for a decade was gone, and in its place was a vast, echoing silence. The first person to break that silence was my mother. She appeared at my hotel room door a week later without calling first. The perfect, elegant armor of Catherine Caldwell was gone. She was just a woman, her face pale and her eyes red rimmed and exhausted. I let her in, and we sat in a tense, heavy silence for a long time. I kept a box for you, she finally said, her voice a raw whisper. After you left, I put things in it, your science fair ribbons, photos, your old journals from college. I told myself I was saving them for when you came home. Tears began to stream down her face, slow and silent. I was a coward, Elena. I was so afraid of your father's disapproval, so terrified of upsetting the life I had built, that I stood by and let him break your heart. Then I stood by and let your brother steal your soul. Keeping the peace, that's what I told myself. But it wasn't peace. It was just a quiet, polite, ugly war, and I chose the wrong side. There is no excuse for what I did, only a reason, and it's a shameful one. I am so sorry. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, it was a confession. And it was the first true thing she had said to me in over a decade. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, forwarded from my office. It was from Ethan. He was in a treatment center in Arizona. He wrote that the public humiliation had been the rock bottom he had been running toward his whole life. He confessed everything: the theft, the lies, the jealousy that had eaten him alive. He said he had spent his life trying to be the son our father wanted, and in doing so had become a man he didn't even recognize. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. Hashtag meta, he says. Zero point zero 0.05. He seemed to have aged 20 years. He struggled to turn the chair to face me. His speech was slurred from the stroke, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a terrible, clear eyed shame. He gestured for me to come closer. Elena, he said, the word a monumental effort. The the plan, your plan. You were right. He took a ragged breath. I was wrong. Wrong about you. Wrong about everything. He pushed a heavy leather-bound book across his desk toward me. It was my grandfather's private journal, the one he had kept since the day he planted the first vine. It was the soul of Caldwell Crest, filled with his sketches, his notes on the soil, his dreams. It was the true book of our family's legacy. It was the one thing he had never shown Ethan. It was always for you, he whispered. Should have been you. It has been a year since that night. The fire of my revenge is long gone. In its place, something new and fragile is starting to grow. I am still the CEO of Terraform Dynamics, but I now split my time. The vineyard is no longer Caldwell Crest. It's called Caldwell and Daughter Farms. I am slowly bringing it back to life, not with my father's traditions or my stolen technology, but with a blend of my grandfather's wisdom from his journal and my own hard won knowledge. My father sits on the porch some afternoons, watching. We don't talk much, but in the silence, there is a new language forming, one of mutual, painful respect. My mother works with me, not as a hostess, but as our family's archivist, piecing together the true story of our past. The family is not healed. Some things, once shattered, can never be made perfect again. But it is real. For the first time, it is real. I have learned that revenge can build an empire, but it cannot build a life. Proving them wrong gave me power, but it didn't give me peace. That is a different kind of harvest, one that requires tilling the soil of your own heart. It requires honesty, and it requires the courage to see the broken, fallible people you love, and the courage to let them see you. True victory wasn't the moment I exposed them, it was the moment I began the slow, difficult work of letting them back in. Have you ever felt unseen by the people who were supposed to know you best? Have you ever had to fight to reclaim your own story? The details of our lives are different, but the search for truth and recognition is universal. If my journey resonated